The Iron Fist, Hafez al-Assad's Syria. Hafez al-Assad seized power in Syria in 1970. He ruled with an iron fist. His secret police were everywhere. They watched people closely. Dissent was not allowed. Hafez promoted an image of himself as the protector of Syria. He used the media to spread this message. He silenced anyone who opposed him. Fear became a way of life for many Syrians. Hafez was a master of survival. He played international powers against each other. He secured aid and weapons from both sides. This kept his regime afloat despite its brutality. By the time of his death in 2000, Hafez had left a deep mark on Syria. His legacy was one of oppression and fear, but he had also held the country together. Many wondered what would come next. A promise unkept. Bashar's early years. When Bashar al-Assad inherited power, many hoped for change. He was young and seemed more modern than his father. He spoke of reform and openness. Some believed Syria might be on the cusp of a new era. Bashar's early moves were promising. He released some political prisoners. He allowed a degree of press freedom. He spoke of economic liberalization. For a brief moment, a thaw seemed possible. But the reforms were superficial. Beneath the surface, the old system remained intact. The intelligence agencies continued to operate with impunity. Corruption flourished. The regime's grip on power remained as tight as ever. As time passed, Bashar's true nature became apparent. He was not a reformer, he was his father's son. He would rule Syria with the same iron fist, crushing any challenge to his authority. The Arab Spring ignites hope, gives way to horror. In 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings swept across the Middle East. From Tunisia to Egypt, people rose up against their dictators. Syria too was caught in the wave of unrest. Protests erupted, demanding democracy and an end to corruption. The regime's response was swift and brutal. Peaceful demonstrations were met with live ammunition. Snipers fired on crowds. Thousands were arrested and tortured. Hospitals treating the wounded were shelled. The world watched in horror as the violence escalated. Bashar al-Assad showed no mercy to his own people. He seemed determined to cling to power at any cost. Syria descended into a nightmare of bloodshed and destruction. The use of chemical weapons by the regime in 2013 marked a new low. Hundreds of civilians, including children, were killed in a horrific attack. The world was outraged, but Bashar remained defiant. He had crossed a red line, but there would be no consequences. A toxic alliance, foreign backing for a brutal regime. As the conflict raged, Bashar al-Assad found himself increasingly isolated. Western powers condemned his atrocities and imposed sanctions, but he had powerful allies who stood by him. Iran, with its own regional ambitions, saw in Assad a crucial ally. It provided financial aid, military advisors, and thousands of Shia militia fighters to bolster the regime's forces. Russia, eager to reassert its influence in the Middle East, also intervened decisively. Russian air power proved crucial in turning the tide of the war in Assad's favor. Russian diplomats shielded the regime from international censure. With this foreign support, Assad was able to withstand the pressure. He had become a pawn in a larger geopolitical game, his survival more important to his allies than the lives of his own people. Section 5. The economy crumbles. Hardship fuels dissent. Years of war and international sanctions took a heavy toll on the Syrian economy. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Industries were destroyed. Millions were displaced. Their livelihoods shattered. The Syrian pound collapsed, wiping out savings and pushing millions into poverty. Basic goods became scarce and unaffordable. Hyperinflation made it impossible for ordinary Syrians to make ends meet. The economic hardship fueled resentment against the regime. Even those who had once tolerated Assad's rule out of fear or apathy now questioned his legitimacy. The regime's grip on power, already weakened by the war, began to slip further. Section 6. Cracks in the edifice, signs of regime weakness. By the late 2010s, cracks were appearing in the edifice of Assad's rule. The regime, though still in control of much of the country, was showing signs of strain. The economy was in free fall, corruption was rampant, the security forces were stretched thin, morale within the army was plummeting, soldiers, their pay worthless, deserted in droves. Others refused to fight, questioning why they should die for a corrupt and brutal regime. The intelligence services, once the backbone of Assad's power, were also weakened. Years of war and purges had depleted their ranks. They were no longer able to maintain the same level of control over society. Section 7. The tide turns from whispers to open rebellion. As the regime's grip loosened, dissent, once whispered in private, began to emerge into the open. Protests, fueled by economic hardship and anger at corruption, erupted across government-held areas. This time the regime's response was more muted. The security forces, overstretched and demoralized, were less willing to use brute force. The regime feared that a full-scale crackdown would only spark a wider uprising. The tide was turning. The people of Syria, who had endured so much, were no longer afraid. They had lost their fear of the regime. They were ready to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Section 8. The fall, a swift and ignoble end. The final collapse of their Assad regime, when it came, was swift and dramatic. Faced with mounting internal pressure and dwindling external support, Bashar al-Assad's grip on power finally slipped away. The final straw came when a large contingent of the Syrian army mutinied, refusing to fire on protesters and turning their guns on regime loyalists. The mutiny spread like wildfire, with entire units abandoning their posts and joining the uprising. With his support crumbling, Bashar al-Assad fled Damascus, seeking refuge in a neighboring country. The once mighty dictator who had ruled Syria with an iron fist for decades was now a fugitive, his reign reduced to a humiliating footnote in history. Section 9. A legacy of ruined Syria after the Assads. The fall of the Assad regime marked the end of an era in Syria, but it did not bring an end to the suffering. The country lay in ruins, its economy shattered, its social fabric torn apart. Millions were displaced, their homes destroyed, their lives upended. The scars of war, both physical and psychological, ran deep. The task of rebuilding Syria, both physically and politically, would be monumental. The legacy of the Assads would continue to haunt Syria for generations to come. Their rule had left a legacy of brutality, corruption, and division. It would take time, perhaps generations, for the country to heal from the wounds they had inflicted.